Hello, this is the second video in my series of the history of philosophy, and I'm largely following Sophie's World, which is a novel. If you want to, you could read Sophie's World alongside this. There'll be some overlap, but of course, I have studied things other than Sophie's World, and no doubt that will come into play. The first video I did was on Socrates and the pre-Socratics, or the natural philosophers, as they're sometimes called. And again, this is European philosophy we're talking about here. But probably, well, I don't think it's a probably, the most important Greek philosophers for our purposes. Now, I don't know at the time, whether people thought they were nuts and that there were others, there were other philosophers around. But I would say that as far as the impact on history is concerned, the two greatest Greek philosophers are Plato and Aristotle, both of whom lived in the 300s BC. Socrates was convicted at Athens of corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. He was sentenced to death, which he seemed happy to oblige. He drank the hemlock voluntarily while his followers kind of watched him. Oh, look, I can't feel my toes anymore. And I think it's the either the Phaedo or the Crito where it talks about his death. And so you could certainly, I've done a video on the trial of Socrates. Plato's Apology records that. Plato was just a young man at the time. He wasn't one of the central philosophers of Socrates. I'm sure Socrates knew his name, but it is interesting that Plato would become the torchbearer, as it were, of philosophy from Socrates. But that's the way things happen. Then Aristotle, Plato founded a school called the Academy. Aristotle came from where was he from? He was from Stagira, and he came and studied at Plato's Academy a little bit, but he and Plato did not agree or see eye to eye on many, many things. I have behind me Raphael's School of Athens. You can see Plato and Aristotle there in the middle, with Plato pointing up and Aristotle pointing down. We'll talk about that in a second. Aristotle became a tutor for Alexander the Great as a young man. Philip of Macedon hired him to teach, as you sometimes did. Eventually, Aristotle also started a school in Athens, the Lyceum. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on preface, so let's dive right in. Plato. Plato's metaphysics. So in philosophy, metaphysics is the question of what is real. The term actually comes from Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a book called The Physics, and then Aristotle wrote a book called the Metaphysics, which means after physics. And if physics dealt with the natural realm, metaphysics asked, well, what is real? What is underlying the natural realm? What is the basis of reality? And Plato, the way he answered this was, Plato said, well, there are basically two different realms. The one realm is the world of ideas, the world of the forms and the patterns. Plato believed that the world of my body is a world of senses, of experiences, but these are shadowy worlds, copies of the reality. The reality, as Parmenides, if you remember the previous video, Parmenides said nothing changes. And for Plato, the ideas that stand behind the truth of the world, those are the things that don't change. And in fact, he believed that my soul knew those ideas before my soul took on a body, and that learning is a kind of remembering the things that we knew before we took on a body. Now, this, when you express it in Plato's way, it sounds a little ridiculous. However, I would say a lot of people are variously Platonic. People who think that if you get your ideas straight, then your life will take care of itself, or people who think you've got to plan everything out and get the idea before you actually do anything with it. I'm reading a book right now called The Black Swan, and he pretty much trashes what he calls a platonicity in people, that life is far more a matter of the unexpected than it is of the well-planned. Well, I'll leave that there. But Plato believed that the world of ideas and of forms and of patterns, that's the real world. And that this world that I can sense the world that I can see, that these are just copies of the ideal realities. That this mug is a copy of a heavenly mug, the ideal mug. And I'm not sure whether he would say that. Maybe he would say that the idea is a container, that this is a shadowy representation of the ideal container. I'm not sure. You remember Heraclitus, who said that the fundamental reality of all things is fire, and that everything is changing, and you can't step into the same river twice, and that sort of thing. And so this is the world of our senses. And you might notice the book of Hebrews. I don't, yeah, do I have that there? I have some references from Hebrews. Now, actually, Hebrews is my area of expertise. And I don't actually think that Hebrews is explicitly Platonic, but many translations use the word copy in here, and certainly Hebrews uses the word shadow. But in my opinion, copy is a bad translation. Although if you go to your NIV or whatever, you're probably going to find copy in your translation of Hebrews. I think that's a mistranslation. But it's clear that there are many people who think that there are Platonic elements, maybe not directly, but maybe indirectly in the Bible. But that's not what this video is about. So I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to resist the temptation. But basically, Plato felt like, or believed that our ideas are far more real than this shadowy material realm that we're in. And there have been a number of Christian thinkers throughout the centuries who have been indebted, I think, to a Platonism of a sort. Augustine, who is very important for Protestant thinking. After Augustine, Anselm, you may know from, you probably don't know Anselm from the Middle Ages. Anselm formulated an argument for the existence of God called the ontological argument. Anselm's argument basically amounts to, well, I can conceive of God, therefore God must exist. Descartes in the 1500s, 1600s would also have a certain impact of Platonism on him. I've recently discovered that C.S. Lewis, I think, it has seriously been impacted a bit by Plato. C.S. Lewis's arguments sometimes are like, well, there is this, I have this longing, therefore there must be a reality behind it. Or I have this sense of right and wrong, therefore there must be right and wrong behind it. I think there's a little bit of Platonism hiding in C.S. Lewis's thought as well. One of Plato's, let me guess, aside from the Apology, probably the most famous of Plato's writings is the Republic. And at some point before I die, I hope to do at least one video on Plato's Republic. In the Republic, we find what's sometimes called the myth of the cave. And the myth of the cave is a lovely parable of moving toward enlightenment. So in the myth of the cave, you have some people who are chained to a rock in a cave, and they don't realize it, but the shadows they're seeing on the cave wall in front of them are actually being cast from the cave entrance. As people walk in front of the cave entrance, the sun casts a shadow that they see on the wall of the cave. But because they've not seen anything else, they assume that the shadows they're seeing are reality itself. And of course, for Plato, that would refer to the sense world, the material world that we see around us is the shadowy world for Plato. One of them in the story somehow gets free from his chains, and he goes to the cave entrance. And of course, at first it's difficult for him to see, but he soon realizes that he'd been seeing a shadow all this time, and that actually outside the cave there is this light, and there is the reality that's casting the shadow upon the wall. This is, of course, Plato's theory of ideas, that if we can get beyond our senses and contemplate the ideas, then we'll get to reality. Well, the guy goes back and tries to explain, to his friends, that actually they're not seeing the real thing. They're seeing shadows, the realities up at the cave entrance, and they kill him in the story, which might be a bit of an allusion to Socrates being killed by the Athenians. And Of course, a lot of us philosophers feel persecuted by those who don't understand. One, we're probably not that persecuted, and two, we may not be right. We might actually be crazy. But that's Plato's myth of the cave, and his myth of the cave implores us to move beyond the sensory world that we see and move to the world of contemplating reality with our mind. This may remind you of Descartes. We'll get to Descartes in the story of Sophie's world, but Descartes basically he talks about how if you put a straw in water, it looks like it's crooked. See, your senses are just going to lead you astray, but with your mind that the straw is straight. Okay, that's a little bit of a stretch, I think. I'm not real sympathetic of Plato, to be honest. But let's move on. So, what is Plato's idea of a person, of human psychology? Well, Plato generally did believe that we had an immortal soul. Again, both a soul that pre-exists our body and post-exists our body. Our body, for Plato, is a prison house. Now, this would impact Christian thinking quite a bit. It's not really New Testament thinking. And this is kind of an aha moment people have at some point to realize that the New Testament teaches what we might call the resurrection of the body. And eternity, for at least the vast majority of the New Testament, is about an embodied existence. Paul talks about an embodied resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul assumes, as a good Pharisee in his background, that there must be a body. You can't have resurrection without a body. In fact, the word dead in the phrase resurrection of the dead can be translated, as N.T. Wright would say, resurrection of the corpses. That's at least a possible translation of that. And so the tomb is empty. Jesus, it matters that Jesus' body is not in the tomb because Jesus was resurrected. And so it is significant to realize that the Bible doesn't exactly, or let me put it this way, the New Testament does not emphasize the immortality of the soul. That is a Greek emphasis, and it would become a Christian emphasis in certain Christian thinkers because Platonism would influence early Christianity with Augustine and thinkers like that. Again, I don't have a problem with the concept of an immortal soul. I'm just pointing out that this is one place where our traditions have led us to read certain things where the New Testament itself wasn't necessarily thinking that way a lot of the time. Now, there may be some places in the New Testament where, like the souls under the altar in the book of Revelation, probably has a bit of this flavor to it. But the primary mode of resurrection thinking in the New Testament is the resurrection of bodies. Now, Plato believed that our bodies were inferior. He did not believe that our bodies were evil. That would be Gnosticism. In the 2nd century AD, Gnosticism would take Platonism to the next level in this regard and see the body as evil. But Plato did see the body as inferior. And I would say, in my opinion, I don't even think it's very ambiguous. The New Testament sees the body as inferior. As Jesus says, the flesh is weak. And therefore, under the power of sin, our skin, our flesh, doesn't stand a chance. We don't stand a chance against the power of sin in our bodies because our bodies are weak. We need the antidote of the Holy Spirit, according to Romans 8 and 7 and 8. The Holy Spirit is what gives us victory over the power of sin in our weak bodies. Those who are in the flesh, Paul says in, I think, Romans 8:8, those who are in the flesh cannot please God. And the reason in the flesh, it doesn't mean, well, we won't please God till we're out of our bodies. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying is those who let their sinful flesh, that is their skin under the power of sin, those who let their sin be under the power of sin, skin under the power of sin, and do not tap into the power of the Spirit. Romans 8, there's no condemnation, for the law of the Spirit has set you free from the law of sin and death. So this idea that our skin is weak, our bodies are weak, is something that Plato certainly would have agreed with. Okay, Plato's ethics, his sense of how of values. He was an absolutist. So another story in Plato's Republic is the story of Gyges' ring. And in this story, there's a guy named Gyges who gets this ring that makes him invisible. And of course, he does what he wants. He kills the king, moves in with the queen, and has a high old time. And Plato is trying to argue in the Republic that Gyges shouldn't do this. Plato is an absolutist, which in ethics means no exceptions. If something's right, it's always right. If something's wrong, it's always wrong. Of course, if you want to see my video on duties, the duty approach to ethics, I argue for what I call universal ethics. There are some absolute ethics, love God, love neighbor. Those are the two big absolutes. There may be more, do not murder innocent people for no reason. That's an absolute. In general, I argue that Christianity is more universal ethics, which means that things are right in all places and all times, but there may be situations where a higher value trumps a lower value. Anyway, Plato is an absolutist, and he tries to argue in the Republic that Gyges should do the right thing, whether he gets away with it or not. Now, I'm not sure that Plato, the character that argues against Socrates in the Republic, Thrasymachus, I'm not sure that Thrasymachus doesn't win that argument because, of course, remember, Plato doesn't believe in God. Our belief in God means that nobody gets away with anything in that sense. God knows everything. And so there's no ring that can hide you from God. As Hebrews 4 says, the whole creation is naked and exposed to him. But anyway, so the argument here is ethical egoism. Should I do whatever's in my best interest or absolutism? No, there are rights and wrongs that are always applied. That's what the myth of Gyges' ring is about. But Plato's ethic ultimately is not oriented around duties. That's a fairly modern way of thinking about ethics, where ethics basically reduces to do's and don'ts. Although you might argue that the Pharisees, as portrayed in the New Testament, were a little bit that way. But there is a tendency for us, I would say, in our Western European white culture to focus on do's and don'ts in ethics. And most of the ancient world, and I would say the Bible, is virtue oriented. Rather than asking, what should I do? Although there is that, the primary question is, what should I be? And so, for example, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, the fruit of the Spirit is basically a virtue list. Paul says, whatever is not of faith is sin. Sin is not so much about whether you, and I would argue that Paul doesn't primarily think of sin as falling short of absolute perfection. That anything that misses the mark is sin. I don't think Paul primarily thinks about sin that way. Paul thinks about sin as anything that doesn't come from a heart of faith and allegiance to God. So it's a heart thing. Jesus in Mark 7, unclean comes out of a heart. It's not a matter of what you do with your food and so forth. Plato also believed in a virtue-based ethics. He talked about the 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, which has to do with the head; courage, that has to do with the chest; temperance, which has to do with our guts; and then justice, which is about the balance of all of these doing what they're supposed to do. So that's Plato's ethics. When we take his ethics and then talk about society in general, we can see that for example, take wisdom. Plato lined up the virtue with a part of the body and with a part of the soul, and then with the state. So if wisdom is the virtue that relates to my head, in my soul that's reason, and in the state it relates to the rulers. So there's analogy between all these levels. So if courage relates to my chest. In my soul, it relates to my decision-making faculty, my will. And in the state, it refers to the soldier class. Then again, temperance or self-control relates to my abdomen, my guts. And you might not know this, but in the New Testament, Paul talks about his guts. The old King James said, put on bowels of compassion, put on guts of compassion. In Philemon, if you look at the Greek, splankna, Paul calls the slave Onesimus his guts. I think most translations say my own heart, but it's not heart. It's he's my very intestines appetite, and that relates to the workers. And so you can see Plato has a kind of class system, but it's not by birth. It's a matter of your propensity, what you do in society. And so Plato believed that society should be ruled by philosopher kings, who were great philosophers. Now, I'm not sure that great philosophers necessarily make good ultimate leaders, because a lot of times philosophers, especially someone like Plato, who doesn't make exceptions, leadership involves, well, let me put it this way. Plato had an opportunity to train, so Aristotle trained Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer most of the world. Plato also had a chance to train a king's son. I think it was the king of Syracuse in Italy that Plato helped train. But it's good to be the king, right? And once the son became king, he did whatever he wanted to do. Didn't listen to Plato's training at all. Anyway, okay. So Plato also believed that you could only really be happy in a just society, which I don't think is certainly not Paul's view. Paul says, I've learned to be content no matter my circumstances. Okay, lastly, Plato's aesthetic, his sense of beauty. Plato thought that art was bad. And I have a video on philosophy of art. He thought art was bad because he thought art led you away from reason. And here's the way his thinking went. He believed that matter was a copy of ideas. And so for him, say a painting is a copy of the pattern. And so he thought art is not truthful. It's leading you away from the idea. I mean, it's bad enough to talk about a book that's material, because that's a copy of the ideal book. But then if you draw a book, that's a copy of the reality. And so art is leading you away, because it's not the pattern, it's not even the copy, it's a representation of a copy. He also thought that art had a negative psychological effect because it played on human emotions and human weaknesses. And so he believed that art could be manipulative. And of course, art can be manipulative. I mean, movies can lead us. It's the media art. I'm not sure, but we are easily duped, we human beings, and playing on our emotions is an oldie but a goodie. I mean, people have always been doing that. I mean, I always get a little when I'm watching conventions. When you watch a party convention in politics, they almost always have, here's Sister so and so who died of such and such. And in when I'm elected, we're not going to let people die of such and such. And what you do is you manipulate people's emotions. Now, I'm not saying that you may believe what you're saying, or maybe you won't believe what you're saying. So, I mean, let me just I'm making this video in 2020, and I'm making this up, okay? I'm not trying to cast aspersion on any political candidate. But let's say that I wanted to, well, okay, I don't think Biden is one of the candidates. I don't think he's done this. But you could see someone having, I can't remember, maybe they did do this at the Democratic convention. But let's say that you have somebody sitting in the wings whose father died of COVID, or whatever. And you say, we've got to stop this COVID. And here's somebody whose dad died. And so you're trying to make it seem like you're trying to transfer the emotion that, you feel bad for this person because their dad died of COVID, and then I'm the attach the desire to stop this COVID to me as a particular candidate. Again, I'm not in any way, that was just a complete hypothetical. But Plato would say that art can do that, that art can play on our emotions in a way that leads us away from the truth. And again, it certainly can. Okay, now, he also believed that writing, Plato was opposed to writing. I'm trying to remember which of his dialogues. Plato, he wrote his philosophical works in terms of kind of like plays. We call them dialogues, where you have Socrates talking to various people. And he did have philosophical writings that were more direct as well, but they've not survived. And so what we have left of Plato are these kind of mini plays, these dialogues. And in one of them, let me remind myself which one it is, the Phaedrus. In the Phaedrus, Plato basically says writing makes the memory weak. And so he says we do much better if we memorize things rather than write things down. Well, what's ironic about all this is that Plato's a good artist. I mean, the characters in Plato's dialogues have real arguments. Like I said, I think Thrasymachus beats Socrates in the Republic on the question of Gyges' ring. So Plato is actually, I mean, his characters are round. He doesn't have just stock characters where they're easily vanquished by Socrates. They have real arguments and real characters. So ironically, Plato was a good artist who wrote things down. Well, Aristotle. Okay, maybe I should have just done a video on Plato and a separate one on Aristotle. But let's talk about Aristotle. Again, he studied under Plato for a little bit of a time. Plato, so the reason why he's pointing down in Raphael's School of Athens is because if Plato thought that the ideal forms existed apart from our bodies, for Aristotle, there are forms, there are ideal forms, but they can't be detached from the material world. So the idea of a book cannot be separated from the book itself. And so he actually basically says, let's go out and gather specimens. And actually, Alexander the Great did collect specimens on his journeys because of the inspiration of Aristotle. And Aristotle would say there's nothing in our heads that wasn't first experienced by our senses. So he was a bit of an empiricist in that sense. But still, Aristotle believed that we could abstract the forms of things from material things. He divided up the world into animal, vegetable, mineral, so he's doing some of the things that scientists would start doing again in the 17 and 1800s, at least in the Western world, a taxonomy, a breakdown of classification of things. He has a whole book called The Categories, in which he says, here's the way we divide up reality. So what was his metaphysics? If Plato said there are two realms, the realm of ideas and the realm of the material world, Aristotle saw these two as inevitably intertwined. You can't get the form out of the substance. You can't even see the substance. All you can see is the form of something. And so the forms are not ideas that somehow get put into our bodies for Aristotle. Forms are, as I said, inextricably connected to substance. The form of something for Aristotle are its general characteristics. By the way, if you're Roman Catholic, you may, or you may, even if you're not Roman Catholic, have heard of the doctrine of transubstantiation. The doctrine of transubstantiation is the idea that in communion, the bread and wine actually literally become the body and blood of Jesus. And I didn't understand this for a long time because, and I'm not saying I understand it now, but I thought, well, this is easily verified. All we have to do is have a Roman Catholic priest consecrate a wafer, and then take the wafer, put it under a microscope, and see if it's turned into cells. biological cells, into a body cells. And all we have to do is take the concentrated wine, put it under a microscope, and see whether it's become hemoglobin. Duh. Well, actually, duh on me, because the doctrine of transubstantiation really came into its own in the Middle Ages under a thinker by the name of Thomas Aquinas in the 1100s. And Thomas Aquinas was heavily indebted to Aristotle. So just like we have a stream of the church that's very Platonic, we also have a stream of the church, especially the Roman Catholic Church today, likes Thomas a lot, has been heavily influenced by Aquinas. And so the doctrine of transubstantiation basically says, this is very, very interesting. I was going to say very clever, but in Aquinas's day, this was just what you would say because of Aristotle. So for Aquinas, it's the substance of the bread and wine that becomes the body and blood of Jesus, but not the form. And so, of course, remember, Aquinas lived before the scientific revolution. He certainly lived before anybody knew anything about cells. And so my kind of beginner's thought, well, let's just put this stuff under the microscope. What a contemporary Thomist would say is, well, the cells are still the form. The things you see under a microscope are still the form. A chemical equation is still the form. That the substance that you can't see, so it's unverifiable, it's unfalsifiable. There's no way to prove or disprove this. It's very convenient. I kind of like those things in theology, because then you can't argue against me. But when they say that it becomes the body and blood of Jesus, they're talking about the substance that you can't see. All you can see is the form. The form is its general observable characteristics, its species, as it were. Now, Aristotle, unfortunately, did not have a very high view of women. For Plato, since ideas are not part of our bodies, a woman could be a philosopher king, conceivably, a philosopher queen. A woman could be conceivably a ruler for Plato, because the idea thing is not part of our bodies. But for Aristotle, and this curses on you, Aristotle, Aristotle didn't think women could be thinkers, because they're just the substance. They provide the Plato, but it's the man, the seed of the man, Aristotle would say, that provides the shape and so forth. And so Aristotle did not have a positive view of women, although he does say in his Politics, and I can't remember if I get to this. I'm sure I talk about his ethics here. He does say in his Politics that there are women who are not according to nature. But one of the things we need to be careful in interpreting some parts of the New Testament. So Ephesians and Colossians and First Peter have lists that are called household codes. This is the husband, this is the wife, this is the slave, this is the master, this is the child, this is the parent. And the thing that we need to keep in mind is the way that is set up is very Aristotelian. Aristotle says something very similar in his Politics about the household. And so we have to realize that it's when the New Testament kind of gives equality or empowers the woman. That's the unique part of the New Testament. To say that the husband is the head of the wife, there's nothing uniquely Christian in Paul's world about that kind of a statement, because that's what Aristotle had said several centuries before. And so we have to be careful not to confuse the incarnation, that is the revelation taking on the flesh of its audiences, and including their paradigms and their worldviews to some extent. We need to be able to distinguish what the point of the revelation is, and what the form that it has in that age, in that day, because inevitably what you'll do, that if you don't know that you have to read it in its context, you're going to assume that just some ancient Greek stuff is what God thinks, which makes God stupid. No offense to the Greeks, but I know about cells and they didn't. It's not because I'm smart, it's because God has helped people discover a lot of stuff. I have a cell phone right here. Believe me, Aristotle did not have a cell phone. Aquinas did not have a cell phone. So we have to be very careful when applying the Bible to be able to distinguish what is the clothing the ancient clothing that the revelation came in and what the actual revelation is, because otherwise we simply make God think like an ancient Greek in ways, like we end up as a flat earther, because all of the biblical authors, I assume, believed in a relatively flat earth. Okay, point made. Aristotle talks about 4 causes. This is interesting. Now, we don't think exactly like Aristotle, but he would say that the matter of which something is made up is its material cause. Now, I don't call that a cause. To me, that's just the stuff that something is being caused on. I cause something to happen to the material, but he talks about a material cause as a cause. So if things are form and substance for him, this relates to substance, and then the formal cause relates to the form. And the formal cause is the reason why. So if you step back and say, so why did God allow? So you might say, why did God allow me to forget my keys? And the answer might be because he knew that I would hit a deer if I'd have gone, 30 seconds earlier. And so the reason why, the formal cause, is God didn't want me to get in an accident. The efficient cause of something is what actually causes it. This is what we tend to think of as a cause. So the efficient cause of my concussion was the tree that fell, branch that fell on me. The actual cause. So I swung the bat hit the ball. The efficient cause of the ball flying into the outfield over the fence, of course, home run, is because of the bat hitting it. I'm more like the formal cause, behind the bat, as it were, because I want to win at baseball. So the final cause is, again, something that we don't usually think of as a cause. For Aristotle, the final cause, we would call it the result. So what is the final cause of the branch falling on my head? Well, the final cause was so that I could go to the hospital. We don't think of that as a cause. We think of that as a result. So we have to remember, Aristotle was not a modern person. He didn't think the way that we think necessarily. But still, if you're paying attention to this stuff in Aristotle, you can see that there is a lot of stuff in Aristotle that will be revived in the time leading up to the Reformation and the scientific era. Okay, Aristotle also invented logic, at least Western European logic. The way that the syllogism, the basic unit of logic, works is you have at least 2 premises. So for example, here's an example of a premise, a universal premise. All philosophy professors are brilliant. Of course. Premise 2, then we use a subset of the premise 1. Ken is a philosophy professor, therefore Ken is brilliant. Now, this is a syllogism. You have 2 premises and a conclusion. There can be other premises as well that build. One of the premises is usually a universal, then another of the premises is a subset of the universal, and then you tie them both together. Now, this logic is valid. To say that this logic is valid means that it works. Now, that's different from asking whether or not this is true. So, for example, are all philosophy professors brilliant? Probably not. Is Ken a philosophy professor? Well, sometimes. So the logic can be valid and it be a false syllogism. Whether or not it's a false syllogism depends on whether or not the logic works and the premises are true. But if the logic works and the premises are true, the conclusion must follow. Okay, Aristotle, inventor of the syllogism. Aristotle's ethics. So one of Aristotle's ethical principles is moderation in all things. We call this the golden mean. And I think that this is probably, on the whole, a pretty good advice. So you may like pasta. Well, stick to maybe a little bit. Don't eat 5 bowls of pasta every supper. Moderation in all things. That's pretty good advice, although humans aren't necessarily good at it, especially Americans don't seem to be good at moderation. We are a people of extremes, it seems sometimes. Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, another writing that perhaps I will one day do a video on, he would say that pleasure is the lowest form of happiness, but it's not bad. And then political happiness, being a free and responsible citizen, that's a higher than pleasure, but it's a good happiness. And like Aristotle, I mean, like Plato, Aristotle would say that you can't really be happy unless you're in a just society. That would be something that Aristotle would say. But the highest happiness, he would say, is that of philosophical contemplation, when you really think about reality. And so there you have three forms of happiness, a la Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10. Aristotle also taught that virtue could be a habit. I like this expression that I got from one of my philosophy students once upon a time: motion brings emotion. That if we repeat, if I act lovingly toward someone, let's say there's a person I really can't stand. If I act lovingly toward that person and I keep acting lovingly toward that person, eventually the feelings of affection will possibly follow. I can change my emotions and my emotional patterns by my habits. It's like walking through a field that if I continue to walk through that field following the same path, then that's going to be the path that I go in whenever I get to that field. Okay, Aristotle and Society. Here's a quote from Aristotle in his Politics: "Man and woman is a political animal." He believed that we were social. Humanity was meant to get together into clusters in society. This is what we do. He had a sense of what the best government was and what the worst government was. So the best government, he thought, was a benevolent monarchy where you have a king, and it would be a king for him, a king that is good at heart. That would be the best. Tyranny, where you have a king who's evil, that would be the worst form of government. And so you can see we kind of move from if we could guarantee that kings would always be good and wise, let's go with that. But since we can't, maybe we might want to think about it. Second best, he would say, is aristocracy, which means rule by a few good people. Oligarchy would be ruled by a few bad people. He would say oligarchy is not as bad as a tyranny, and aristocracy not as bad as a monarchy, is not as good as a monarchy. But the third one, he would say a polity or a democracy. And of course, democracy ended in Athens in the 400s, late 400s, and there'd been some excesses to democracy. So democracy can become mob rule if you let basically the crazy masses run the show. That's not going to be great. But if democracy is run by responsible citizens, then that's good. So Aristotle would say that a good democracy is not as good as a good aristocracy, is not as good as a good monarchy, but its negative, mob rule, is not as bad as an oligarchy, which is not as bad as a tyranny. And I've already mentioned Aristotle's comments on the household in his Politics. So we end with Aristotle on art. If Plato thought art was bad because it was irrational, surprise, Mr. Opposite, Aristotle says art is actually good because it is rational. He would say, Plato thought that art was just a representation of a copy of the reality, but the artist, Aristotle would say, in order for the artist to convince you that you're seeing a picture of a pear, the artist has to capture the essence all pear. And so the artist grasps the universal within the particular and puts it on. Now, I don't know what Aristotle would do with Picasso, or some abstract, Salvador Dali. I don't know what Aristotle would do with that. But given the simplistic function of art as representation in ancient Greece, Aristotle thought, no, the the artist is helping you out, because the artist is helping you see the essence of the form. He also said, yes, art does play on your emotions, but it gets it all out. You get a good cry, and then you feel better and you can think better because you've flushed your system of your emotions so that you can think better afterwards. It's a catharsis, Gesundheit. It cleanses and purges those emotions that Plato is so worried about. Well, this has been just a little dabble into Plato and Aristotle. Again, I hope eventually to put up some reviews of some of the primary texts from them at some point before I pass off this mortal coil. So this has been Plato and Aristotle in my series on the history of philosophy.